Hello, I join you in Clown Chic. Today I will be sharing a walkthrough of 107 Days, Kamala Harris's memoir from her 2024 presidential campaign. I did a day-by-day breakthrough where I read quotes and talked about my impression, and then at the end I'll pop in and give you my overarching thoughts. Hello, just about to start 107 days, and I don't know what to expect. I hear there's some searing things about the Democratic Party and who didn't show up for her during the campaign, but that's about all I've heard, so let's see. Howdy. I have only read like 12 pages because I'm tired. So far I'm surprised by the level of specific details. The book starts off with 107 days to the election, the day that Biden called her up being like, I'm dropping out, I want you to run, and I'm going to endorse you. There isn't much after that exact moment. And then the second chapter is back in time a bit to the month prior, 131 days to the election, the day of his presidential debate. And we all know how that went with Trump. So far, I'm very surprised by the level of detail she's giving in terms of like what it looks like when she gets a call from Biden. She's dropping like full names of staffers. Not that that's not like publicly available information. I just think it's interesting. And she also comments on certain things about the calls for him to drop out, he said, would probably continue, he being Biden. People were throwing his own words back at him that he had said he would be a transitional leader. I assume she won't comment on like why he ran in the first place because that's his story more than hers, but I think that is interesting to include. She also kind of refers to Biden's like inner team as being separate from her. And I know that the president and vice president have different teams, but I do think it's interesting that she wouldn't be considered part of his inner team. I think the timing of this memoir is interesting and probably a first. I also, when I was picking up the book, shout out Noe Valley Books in San Francisco, I think the blurb is very interesting. It says, for the first time, with surprising and revealing insights, Kamala Harris tells the story of one of the wildest and most consequential presidential campaigns in American history. Okay, pretty standard. And then it kind of jumps to, your Secret Service code name is Pioneer. You're the first woman in history to be elected Vice President of the United States. On July 21st, 2024, your running mate, Joe Biden, announces that he will not be seeking re-election. The presidential campaign will occur on November 5th, 2024. You have 107 days. Like, that's kind of written like a novel. Specifically like a spy novel. It's kind of the vibe that gave me. So I think that's kind of an interesting marketing technique. I do think that's an interesting angle. So anyway, more updates to come. Hello.
Hi. This was bullying me.
I was just about to talk about my second update.
Oh.
I read about 40 more pages today, and I'm just continually surprised about the information she's revealing, especially about her kind of perception of how Biden himself sees her, as well as Jill, and the administration as a whole, meaning mostly Biden's team. There's this whole funky part where Harris is calling up members of the Democratic political party, listing like the Clintons, Obama, Bernie Sanders, etc. And some of them, Nancy Pelosi, some of them are really just like random and funny. The best one is Gavin Newsom, hiking, will call back, parentheses, he never did. Okay. And then there's another one from Westmore, governor of Maryland. You've been loyal. I respect that. Okay. Like, there was surely more to that conversation, but that's all she included. So that didn't really say much. Other than that, talks about the loyalty that she and her husband, Doug, had given to the Bidens. And even that being after she felt like he didn't really give her substantial roles as vice president. Again, talking about Joe deciding to run, she says, quote, it's Joe and Jill's decision, end quote. We all said that, everyone, referring to everybody on the campaign team, like a mantra, as if we'd all been hypnotized. Was it grace or was it recklessness? In retrospect, I think it was recklessness. Yikes, pretty bad. She got a lot of just general misogyny, racism on her role, and she felt like the administration didn't back her up when she was facing criticism. There's a line that says, "Indeed, it seemed as if they decided I should be knocked down a little bit more." Just some pretty, like, intense lines like that are very accusatory. There's another line that says, "No one around the president advocated for something that she can win with." I don't know if it's typical for the president's team to give the vice president some, like, quick wins. That would make sense, you know, for just optics. There's another time where she was giving a speech on the crisis in Gaza, and kind of in discussing the reaction from the team at the White House. She says, "It was a speech that had been vetted and approved by the White House and the National Security Council. It went viral and the West Wing was displeased. It was castigated for apparently delivering it too well." And I've just kind of gotten to the point where she's talking about Biden saying that he's a Zionist, which I actually didn't know he ever said, but I'm not that surprised about given his support for Israel throughout his career, and that she tried to encourage him to, you know, show as much empathy to the Palestinians as he does to the people of Israel after the Hamas attack on October 7th. So, yeah, I kind of stopped there because once again, I am tired. Now at 102 days to the election, so it's really only been the very first few days after she'd been announced. All right, see you tomorrow. Hello, please excuse the washing machine in the background. I have just read about 40 more pages. I'm now about a third of the way through the book, and pretty much the entirety of the last 40 pages have been on Harris in that kind of like 2-week push to get a vice president before she's officially nominated. And also some like key decisions while actually still serving as vice president. The first chapter I read today was on how Harris wanted Buttigieg as her VP, and that they're really close, as well as with her being friends with his husband Chasten. There's a whole thing that literally says, "Pete Buttigieg was my first choice, Harvard grad, multilingual, Rhodes Scholar, business consultant, naval intelligence officer, twice elected Midwestern mayor, cabinet secretary, loving husband and father. He was well qualified in so many respects. And then he would have been an ideal partner if I were a straight white man. But we were already asking a lot of America to accept a black woman married to a Jewish man." This is what I kind of assumed happened, or was the thought process when Buttigieg wasn't announced as a candidate for vice president. But kind of what I thought was most interesting here is she really just mentions identifying as a black woman or being perceived rather as a black woman. I found it interesting that she doesn't include being Asian or mixed, probably because of like the perception of her race rather than how she identifies. But either way, pretty interesting. The name dropping really continues the insight into like specific names in the administration, and like projects continues. Like she talks about the secret project called the STARS Project, where she and her team identifies like younger talents in the Democratic Party and she meets with them. She like names all these people on her list. She talks about reassuring global leaders about the United States in the future. She says, "When I would say America is back, they would say, for how long? I always reassured them while silently praying that what I said would remain true." Pretty crazy given the times we're in. And she talks about strategizing for the debate and like being prepared for how low Trump would get with his insults. There's one really crazy line that says, in referring to Trump, "He's an expert at suggesting that someone is a fraud, that you cannot believe this person, which I believe some psychologists would call projection." Which is just funny. Like, it's just funny. And then she talks a lot about like Trump attacking her in terms of race and saying that she's like Indian and that he didn't even know she was a black woman, which is crazy. But anyway, She says, I was running to be president, not to be an American history professor. It wasn't my duty to school the former president on America's racial history, the one-drop rule, the one-eighth law, and how this history had been and still is weaponized. Bars. There's also some like really short chapters intermixed here that talk about her diplomatic efforts, a lot on Palestine and Gaza and the conflict with Israel. It kind of became the one issue many people voted on in this campaign. So I would see why she would want to focus on that. Those chapters do kind of feel a little bit off topic because this memoir is centered on her campaign, but they are important because she was still like working as a VP during this time for Biden, and they also demonstrate the admin's impact too, which honestly I don't think was really publicized well. And then I just read the chapter where she interviews all three of the candidates, Mike Waltz, as we know, Josh Shapiro, and also someone that I didn't know was a candidate, Mark Kelly. Didn't know anything about him. So she talks about like how difficult it is campaigning and also governing and how she has to balance that. But then she gets into every single interview she had and the experience with each of the three candidates. And it's kind of crazy because she was like, oh, it was so hard to decide. But then when she talks about the three of them, she talks about Josh Shapiro going first. She kind of talks about like how he was really concerned about like wanting to be in every room with her for every decision. He was asking like her team about like what it would look like to include Pennsylvania related stuff, West Wing, so kind of like assuming already in that role. And then with Mark Kelly, it's a little less critical and more like concern. There's one part where he says he also hadn't yet had an oh shit moment in his relatively short political career. I wasn't sure how he would cope with the kind of garbage Trump would throw at him. And then a little bit more on that, and then eventually I realized that I couldn't afford to test Mark Kelly in that ugly grinder. But then Waltzer's like, oh, he's like undermining his own abilities, but like he and I had more similarities than I thought, and like he'd be great. So I thought it was kind of funny that she's like, oh, it was so hard to decide, which yes, it is a heavy decision, especially to do so quickly. From the way it's written here, it seems like it was no contest. There are also some like really poignant points. I'll read this one section because I think it really is like the kind of commentary I was looking for when I picked up this book. So in referring to one of her team members, the one who was like picking up all of the candidates for vice president for their interviews and trying to kind of, gauge what the three of them are like outside of the interview. She refers to her social secretary and residence manager, Storm Horncastle, in this way. She has an exquisitely tuned sense of protocol, is an excellent judge of character, and does not hold back her opinions. I thought it would be telling to see how each finalist treated her. Over the years, I've learned it's one thing how people treat me, it's another to see how they behave towards someone they perceive as less powerful. I'm especially sensitive to this because as a child, I saw how my mother, a small brown woman with a foreign accent, would be treated in a fancy department store and other public places as it didn't belong or couldn't afford to be there. She was a distinguished scientist doing groundbreaking research, but often I saw her encounter derision and disrespect. And I feel like most of this book is focused on kind of like the inner workings of the campaign, especially for like how unprecedented her situation was. This is the kind of insight and the first POC woman running for president that I wanted. So I really, found that part most thought-provoking. So yeah, I'm about a third of the way through and I'll keep you updated. Howdy, it's the third day of me reading 107 Days. And after my update yesterday, I did read a little bit more. So I'm going to catch up on what I read yesterday as well as today. So as of the last update, I'd gotten about a third of the way through, or about 100 pages, really leading up to the interviews of the three vice presidential candidates, or picks. And by the end, she picks Waltz, as we all know. So from there, kind of get into the reaction from Josh Shapiro and Mark Kelly Josh and Mark both being like pretty gracious. And then she gets back into her work as VP as well. And there's one really kind of funny quote that says, I will never discuss here or anywhere else the conversations in that room, the middle of the night calls to gather there, the dramas that unfolded. Unlike the current national security team, we did not hash out our plans on Signal. America's national security relies heavily on classified information that our adversaries tried very hard to acquire. Why make it easy for them? And where is the professionalism? Where is that self-discipline? So, this is some commentary on the Trump administration as she talks about work in like the Situation Room more broadly. She mentions how Waltz and his family are pretty new to the national spotlight, so it's pretty overwhelming for them. There's this cute line that says, my first job that night was to introduce Tim Waltz to the country. This was not hard. The man has a biography that could provide scripts for several Hallmark movies. So we're about 90 days to the election now. The vice presidential candidate has been chosen ahead of the nomination convention. There's some attacks from Vance on Waltz, especially some of his like missteps in the past. Harris has some commentary at a rally where the crowd is chanting "lock him up," referring to like Trump being convicted felon. And she responds with, I dislike that chant when Trump aimed it at Hillary, and I wasn't about to encourage it at my rallies. In the democracy I cherish, we don't lock up people because they are political opponents. They are locked up if a jury determines they have committed serious crimes. As a former prosecutor, I know what it means to ask that someone be locked up. I know the seriousness of depriving someone of their liberty. It's not something I've ever taken lightly. I carry the moral weight of it. I would never reduce it to a chant to please and entertain a crowd. And she emphasizes values really being aligned with following protocol, with respecting rules and laws throughout. So that's something she drills in throughout this memoir. There's some commentary on Elon Musk, and like how he became a big Trump supporter and kind of alt-right activist. And we are at 78 days to the election at the convention. They were running behind schedule at the convention. So they had to cut a few things for speeches that were going long. And one thing was a video about Joe that Steven Spielberg worked on was regretfully sacrificed. So that's kind of random. You can call out to Biden giving an almost hour-long speech, and it's mostly on his legacy and the work of the administration. And she mentions that if we waited for some personal stories about working with me, what qualities he had seen that led him to endorse me, they weren't there. And then eventually he says his endorsement at the very end of the speech. So there's continuously call-outs about, Joe not really supporting her fully or really to the extent that she expects. Kind of after the convention, start going back and forth again between the work as vice president that Harris has continued to do, as well as being on the campaign trail. So she talks a lot about wanting to address the nuance of the situation in Gaza and between Israel and Palestine, and there's commentary on a speech that she gives. As David Von Drehl wrote in the Washington Post, it was, quote, the rockiest, most perilous passage. Her 5 degree of difficulty straddle on the war in Gaza. She charged right in and defended Israel, and just as it felt as if the room split, she affirmed the humanity and suffering of the Palestinians. She then moved into preparation on the subject that everyone was able to cheer for, and behold, she had her boat through the impossible strait. I'm not sure that it really felt like that to a lot of Gen Z, where Gaza was a big issue for them, but that's one way it was framed in this memoir. She continues to talk about the campaign, in particular her first major interview with CNN, 68 days to the election. She talks about like the lighting being really bad, making her look tired. She did it with Waltz and later thought that was a mistake because of how she kind of had to look to him. And they really hadn't acclimated yet. He talks about, again, being a prosecutor and a lawyer and realizing that needing to know the details of the case and weighing her every word were important. She says, I wanted the interview to be flawless. I needed my A game. I didn't bring it, and that's on me. Also, talks about answering a question, what she would do on day 1 as vice president, and says, it was a good answer, but there was a better one. I should have simply said, I haven't done those things because I am not president yet. It was a chance to offer a small civic class reminder the vice president serves the president's agenda. She does not have the power to forge her own. That's in reference to the question why she hadn't done certain things or as a vice president already. She kind of repeats this a couple times as well, that like she's not president, she's really just executing Biden's agenda. There's also a chapter that talks about like the impact on kind of the racism that she experiences on individual people as her supporters, which I think is important. There's more issues like gun control. She mentions she's a gun owner herself and later mentions that like she thinks people have the right to defend themselves, which I didn't know. All about like debate prep and how grueling that is. She even has one like team member dress up as Trump, like orange makeup and like red long tie, everything to kind of try and throw her off and make sure that she's ready for everything Trump could throw at her. And then right before the debate, after she's feeling prepared, has been like broken down by her team and then brought back up again, she gets a call from Biden. She's like excited to kind of have a pep talk, you know, she's honored that he's calling her to wish her good luck. And then she describes how he says he's calling to wish good luck, but that there was some like little warmth in his voice. And then he mentions some people he's heard aren't supporting her. And she's just kind of confused why he's bringing this up. And then he just kind of continues to rattle on about his own former debates. And again, she's just more confused. And then there's a passage that says, "The pressure I was under before I would step onto that stage, the debate stage, was immense. I just likened it to a fighter going into a boxing ring for the big prize fight. And that's what it felt like, only worse, because the outcome of my performance wasn't just a win or loss for me. It had grave consequences for the country, even for the world. My head had to be right. I had to be completely in the game. I just couldn't understand why he would call me right now and make it all about himself, distracting me with worry about hostile power brokers in the biggest city in the most important swing state." So, yeah, eventually she's able to let go with help of Doug, but that's rough for her, kind of throwing her off. Like once she kind of leaves the debate stage, where she said, "I felt like the survivor in the aftermath of a bomb blast, barely able to hear what was being said to me from the whooshing in my ears." It feels like kind of a weird comparison. It feels a little bit insensitive to me because she wasn't in a bomb blast and like she hears stories about that all the time from her work. But anyway, that was kind of odd to me. Then there's some moments that are pretty infamous to the election, or really the lead up to the election, where Trump has an assassination attempt. And then there's one conversation where Harris calls Trump and is like, "I'm so glad that you're okay." And apparently he's just like effusively nice to her. Just, you know, saying that like she did a really good job at the debate, that his daughter is a big fan. And then there's a passage here that says, "He was being amiable. This man who had called me dumb, lazy, crazy, and mentally impaired, implied that I drank and took drugs, said I was a Marxist, a fascist. People had told me that he had the capacity, one-on-one, to show a warmer side, that he could even be charming. I hadn't believed it, but now he's experiencing it. And then a reality check. He's a con man. He's really good at it." Crazy work. Pretty crazy. He talks about going on some podcasts. She talks about like she's losing ground with younger voters, especially with young men. Talks about this. It says, "Pundits speak about the frat boy flank. I don't think of them in these reductive terms. Instead, I think about these young voters coming of age during COVID, unnaturally isolated, their lives lonely when they should have been at their most social. In the very moment their world should have been widening, it had been contracted. For some, the voices that filled the void belonging to Andrew Tate, Myron Gaines, and others who grab attention with get-rich or fitness content, then deliver arguments that feminism is damaging to masculinity and women, quote, need to know their place, end quote." Which, yeah, are realities of the world today and, you know, in a post-COVID world. Now we are 40 days to the election, about 2/3 of the way through the book. Since we last caught up, we were 40 days to the election. A lot more commentary on Trump. So, like, we're at the point in September where Hurricane Helene was going through the U.S. Harris talks about, like, not being at the kind of center of the volunteers to, like, let them do their work, and then she was going to go in the next couple of days. Transitions to talk about immigration. There's this one interesting part where they're in Arizona going to the border, and she says, took a walk along a line of fence built during the Obama administration. Trump had once staged a photo op touting his big, beautiful wall, but he'd done it in front of a section that Obama built. One of the many things I prepared to say at the debate, this was one observation I regretted not delivering. That was interesting, I didn't know that. And then she makes more commentary on, like, Trump not actually increasing border agents or the number of border judges, but just, you know, creating hate and division during his administration. There's more short chapters interspersed on, like, time that she's able to be home, literally just for, like, a couple hours, kind of the rush of each day. She talks about then visiting people affected by Hurricane Helene, and she does a lot to, like, talk to the people directly, and she ends her time with, like, the massive relief effort from the administration, as sadly in the aftermath, polls in the affected communities would show that whether people felt that the federal government had done a good job split exactly on party lines. We transition to Waltz's debate with J.D. Vance, and J.D. Vance, like, tempering down his kind of level of intensity to not seem like he was contrasting as much with Waltz, and then Waltz, like, fell for it and was, like, kind of nodding along and being amiable. Harris was not happy with that. And there's a lot on, like, Waltz having to adjust to his family being attacked and, like, personal life being brought into the limelight. Then we're about, like, 30 days from the election and talking about, like, newspapers, specifically Los Angeles and the Washington Post, not specifically endorsing her, kind of citing that, like, the news used to not endorse a politician, but really it's just, like, Jeff Bezos being behind the Washington Times stopping this. There's a big ad, like, kind of infamously, like, the trans ad on sports networks that the Harris administration didn't kind of go against or put up a counter ad. More like manipulation of statements she'd made or parts of speeches or ads that the Trump campaign was really, like, playing into. There's a part 2-3 weeks from the election where she and Doug get in a fight, and they kind of land on, like, we can't go against each other. So a little bit more look into her personal life. As we get to, like, within the 2 weeks of the election, she's talking more about, like, her mother and her relationships there, and getting a little bit more sentimental. Wonders from Biden that doesn't help the campaign. She makes an effort to go visit, like, unions, be with the people, but at this point it's really, like, most people have voted via mail, and there's not a whole lot that can be done, and it's still super close. And there's one line that says, after 105 days of nonstop campaigning, the word weary had taken on a whole new meaning. I can't even imagine. Now we're up until election day. I have about 25 pages left. And after that, I'll give my thoughts on the book as a whole. From the last update, I had 25 pages left. And essentially it was election day, and then the day after election day, and then certification day, so January 6th, when Trump was sworn in, and then an afterward. Election day, she's in Philly, really just talking with the people. There's a line that says, it says a lot about how traumatized we both were by what happened that night that Doug and I never discussed it with each other until I sat down to write this book. So Doug had a bad feeling about the way the campaign was going, but didn't say anything, just to kind of keep the spirits up, but he wasn't feeling great about it. At the end of the election day, ends up not giving kind of the inspiring speech she was planning to give at Howard University, and she just is like, we're gonna see how it is tomorrow. And obviously it's close, but she doesn't win. The day after the election chapter opens with, "I was ashamed to realize I was in the denial and bargaining stages of grief, a very long way from acceptance. I could objectively diagnose what I was experiencing. I had no cure for it." So this chapter is really tough. She kind of ends election day trying to, have some inspiration for the people on kind of where democracy is going, whether or not she wins. But the day after the election day is really just a tough day for her to do that. She says, "But this wasn't just any election. I had argued throughout the campaign that the stakes of this race were exceptionally high. I needed to find a way to motivate people, especially young people, to stay in this fight. I wanted to communicate that the stakes were high. We did something. We had accomplished something that we could not, just in one night, lose." She ends that being like, "We will continue fighting, we will win, even though we didn't win this election." And then after that, certification day, and essentially that's all about, swearing Trump in, and she focuses a lot on doing that the right way. So there's a quote, "Donald Trump had done everything he could to subvert an election, stand in the way of the peaceful transfer of power, and deny the will of the people," referring to in 2021, the January 6th insurrection and storming of the Capitol. And then continues, "I was there to keep my oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I would uphold the rule of law." And then she ends the book saying how many votes Trump got and how many votes she got as part of swearing him in, and ends with, "It was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. I stood there and did my duty for democracy. And that day, democracy stood. As I finished speaking, both sides of the aisles rose and applauded as one. And on that day, democracy stood" is telling. After that, it's the afterword, which starts with her planning to go back to LA. And it's in the midst of the LA fires, which just feels cruel from the world. Then it kind of transitions to her seeing what Trump starts to implement with Project 2025, and attacking democracy claims like that. But she tries to keep an uplifting tone while also talking about the harm that's being done. So she says, "Don't be duped into thinking it's all chaos. It may feel like chaos, but what we are witnessing is a high velocity event, the swift implementation of agenda that was written many decades ago." So she's talking about not only Trump, but the movement that has been built behind him. One pretty damning line that says, "When I decided to become a prosecutor, I had to defend that decision to my family, like a student defending a thesis. I asked why, when we seek change, must it be either by breaking down doors or crawling on bended knee? I wanted a seat at the table. I wanted to make change from inside the system. Today, I'm no longer sure about that, because the system is failing us at every level: executive, judicial, legislative, corporate, institutional, media. Every single guardrail that is supposed to protect our democracy is buckling. I thought those guardrails would be stronger. I was wrong." And after that, it's acknowledgements, where she mentions every person on her campaign by name. So obviously, the acknowledgements are pretty long. So that's through the end of the book. And then for overall thoughts, I will say each chapter is pretty much a day on the campaign, give or take a couple. And sometimes she only has a third of the page where she talks about just really simple kind of what the experience of the day was, rather than specific events. And I think that really works well to keep the pace of the book. It's a pretty quick read. I had to step away sometimes, because of the intensity of the events and topics discussed, but overall it was pretty quick to read and kept the pace going. It doesn't dwell on the historic nature of her campaign and her career that much, but she kind of emphasizes the need to serve the country during her historic campaign. And she does mention where there's some moments where her staffers kind of encourage her to take something in, or she reflects on her mom, how much progress has been made since her years growing up. There isn't a whole lot of reflection on that. It's really more a tell-all and a behind the scenes of the campaign than it is any kind of reflection or analysis. But she does reflect on some things that she's like, "Oh, I should have done this better," especially in separating herself from Biden more. She talks a lot about not realizing how deeply unpopular Biden was by the end of the administration. So she has a couple parts where she's like, "I should have separated myself more from him." There's so many specific details on the inner working of the White House and the Biden-Harris teams, you know, besides the campaign, but like actually serving as vice president. And I know that this book must have been like thoroughly reviewed and approved by the government, but it's just like, it feels almost slightly irresponsible to me to like be publishing this so close to when you had your vice presidential run, because it's like recent history that just happened and we're going to be experiencing the effects of the Biden-Harris administration even though we're in a new administration. So it was just pretty crazy to me how much was shared in this book and how little time had lapsed between the election results and the publishing of this book. There's also so much name dropping, names of staffers, members of the Democratic and Republican parties. I feel like that's what most people would expect from this book. And also like specifics of private conversations with Biden, which I'm sure she, you know, shared with him to get a permission personally, but still kind of crazy. She makes certain claims that don't have citations. So she includes a lot of statistics but doesn't have any footnotes, and I was expecting a bibliography at the end, but there isn't one. And then kind of going back to the swift nature of the book, with every chapter being a day, give or take, she definitely knows how to end the chapter with like a damning takeaway on like either that day or the issue at hand. She also mentions a lot of specific political figures and journals, but then kind of refers to pundits in speaking generally about like the impact of certain events on the election results. There are definitely a few key themes that are reiterated about the campaign throughout the memoir. One being like corporate corruption affecting public perception of her campaign, Biden's like deep unpopularity and Harris's lack of kind of separation from his brand, in part due to her pride of working as his VP, but also loyalty to him, as well as a lack of understanding of how deeply unpopular he was. Biden's like many kind of public blunders in the media, and a third of the US like not showing out to vote. I will say I think it's pretty funny how there are two quotes before we get into the book, and I'll read them for you. "The amount of energy necessary to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. Alberto Brandolini." And then the second quote, "I got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I was born like this. Kendrick Lamar, DNA." In terms of like actually liking this book or not, I think it depends on how you feel about Kamala Harris overall. If you already like her going to this book, you're gonna read it and leave liking her. If you dislike her, you're going to read this book and come out of it still disliking her. It isn't really that persuasive in changing your opinion one way or another, but it's really just a tell-all and BTS from the campaign with more like reflections than actual analysis. This book also kind of reads like her trying to reclaim the narrative around the campaign and comment on what an alternative America would have looked like under her administration, which I think makes sense. I just think it's crazy that it just came out instead of, you know, decades down the line when presidents are retired from their political careers and we as a country are displaced a couple administrations away. Overall, I gave this just straight in the middle 3 stars. I thought it was well paced. I thought it was interesting. It just didn't do a whole lot for me. But now, having read this video, you know what happens. That's the video for this week. Thanks for watching. I know it was a long one, so thanks for listening along. And if you have any thoughts on the book, feel free to drop them in the comments. We can chat about it. Yeah, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you later.